Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm diving deep into the topic of happiness, but not in the way that you might expect, because my guest doesn't just want us to be happy, he wants us to go beyond it. And if that sounds idealistic, bear with me because this is fascinating stuff. He is Dr Mark Fabian, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the University of Warwick and an affiliate researcher at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge University. And he's the author of a brilliant new book called Beyond Happy: How to Rethink Happiness and Find Fulfilment. If you've ever found yourself wondering why chasing happiness often feels like running on a treadmill, or why modern life seems set up to make us constantly strive for more without ever feeling satisfied, then this is the episode for you. Mark brings a unique blend of economics, philosophy, psychology, and public policy to his work. In this conversation, we explore why public policy often misses the point on well-being, what the ancient Stoics and modern science can teach us about living a good life, and why we need to rethink happiness as more than just feeling good. Mark argues that instead of aiming to be perpetually happy, we should focus on building a life that's fulfilling, meaningful, and grounded in community. We talk about the hedonic treadmill, the role of identity in well-being, and how embracing ancient wisdom, everything from fairy tales to religious rituals, can help us to navigate the complexities of modern life. You'll hear why he thinks the self-help industry is letting us down, why emotional intelligence is underrated, and why building our own personal operating system is critical in a world where quick fixes and hacks often fall short. This is a conversation that I hope will on some level make you think, reflect, and review how you approach your own life. It certainly did that for me. So whether you're looking for practical wisdom or a deeper philosophical take on happiness and well-being, you're in the right place. It's my discussion with Dr. Mark Fabian on Beyond Happy. Mark, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Looking forward to the chat.
I'm really excited to have you. I loved the book and we'll talk about that. But before we do that, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an associate professor of public policy at the University of Warwick. And you mentioned to me in the pre-show chat that you weren't quite sure what that was. So let me tell you a little bit about what I do. So I'm a traditional academic. I do a lot of teaching and I do some research. Most of my research is on well-being and happiness and things like that. And I do some psychology of that and some philosophy. The public policy angle, I suppose there's maybe two parts to it. So one is kind of policy design. So when you think about how to organize the NHS so that it delivers better healthcare outcomes, that's a policy design question. There'll be a lot of tools from economics, from sociology, from psychology, from management science all over the place. And we try to bring those together in policy studies. A lot of policy studies isn't really about kind of making public policy better, which does irritate me. It's more about kind of describing how public policy operates, which I find a bit dull. Like we just keep sort of talking about how bad it is, whereas I think we could spend a lot more time talking about how to make it better. I think one thing that doesn't get talked about enough in the mainstream discourse, but is talked about a lot by academics, is how important the administration of government is. So often when we think about fixing the NHS, we sort of think about, oh, should we use more markets? Should we nationalize it? These kind of big questions. When actually a lot of it's just going to come down to like IT systems and how human resources handles payroll. And that's going to have a lot to do with it. And I think we need to have more of those kind of conversations, but that's usually a bit dry for podcasts.
No, for this one, because I love the way you talk about it. But you were talking about public policy. How does that link to happiness? Because in my glib comment, much of public policy seems to not deliver happiness.
Indeed. And I actually have a book coming out next year called The Wellbeing State, which is all about wellbeing public policy. Maybe one short intro to that sort of stuff is that over the last, say, 30, 40 years, there's been a very strong emphasis in policy design on using ideas from economics. And I have a PhD in economics. I like economics a lot of the time, but I think it's led us astray in many ways. And one of the main ones is that we conceptualize people who deliver public services, particularly teachers, nurses, police officers, social workers, and other street level bureaucrats, as they're called. We conceptualize them as knaves, like people who are only motivated by money. And we need to hold them accountable using these very particular metrics, like how many crimes they solve, for example. And what that ends up doing is it sort of demotivates the people who are mission-led bureaucrats, like people who really care about being a good social worker or getting good educational outcomes. And it kind of limits their autonomy and limits their ability to think about how to deliver effectively in their local context. The other thing that it does is that it means that people sort of try to game the system on those particular metrics. So there's a very famous scene from The Wire, this show about Baltimore police, where the police turn up at a crime scene and they think about, can we solve this crime? Like, are the odds good that we're going to figure it out? And they decide that it's not, that they're probably not going to solve it. And so they just don't register it at all. They don't put it into the system because their incentive payments are based on how many crimes they solve. So they don't want to put the hard crimes into the system. And that's a lot of the source of the bad outcomes that we've had over the last 40 years. We got some really good outcomes out of the approach. Like garbage collection is much better than it used to be because that sort of thing is really compatible with garbage collection, but it's not compatible with the sort of things that are inherent to well-being. So things like mental health, community cohesion, identity, meaning and purpose in life, this sort of stuff. It's very hard to measure those things. And we really do need bureaucrats who are keen on the public interest and civic life and these kind of moral and ethical things, not just money.
And that, I guess, takes us beautifully to the book Beyond Happy, which, needless to say, I thoroughly enjoyed and as a think quite hard. We'll come on to explore why that might be. But the title's Beyond Happy. Why isn't being happy enough? Why do we need to go beyond it?
Well, yeah, maybe that's a good way to phrase it. Not quite enough, or like that's not the whole picture, is maybe how I would want to describe it. So I think there are a lot of people who work on well-being and the good life and these kind of things who are really down on happiness. And I used to be a bit like that. So I thought what really matters is that you have purpose in your life. What really matters is that you're a values-driven individual, this kind of stuff. And when you're living a life that's very purposeful and based in endeavors, you often feel frustrated. You often feel disappointed. There's a lot of these kind of negative emotions in there. And if you're really fixated on being happy, then you'll just never engage in these more substantive things that bring fulfillment, bring a sense that your life is meaningful and significant. So those kind of people who get really bogged down in doing the big things, they tend to undervalue happiness, I think. But as I was pursuing this kind of life myself, I increasingly felt that this is just a bit sad. Like I should be happier more of the time if I think my life is good. And also that there needs to be some payoff for you to be able to sustain that kind of work for a long period of time. And so I think happiness and joy and things that you can celebrate are really important. So it's not that the book is down on happiness. There's a lot of stuff in the book on how to be happier, on how to kind of extend your good moods, get rid of your bad moods, smile more, this sort of stuff. I just want people to move beyond that. And part of the reason why I want them to move beyond that is because we are prone to this phenomenon that psychologists call the hedonic treadmill, which is roughly the idea that our neurochemistry is wired mostly by evolutionary forces, such that we always come back to a kind of emotional baseline pretty quickly, unless we have a really sustained stress. Like if you're in solitary confinement, you might start to feel terrible and stay feeling terrible. But if you miss the bus or your doctor's appointment is running late or something and you just feel a bit pissy, that's probably not going to last very long. And the same thing is basically true of your good moods as well. You always come back to this kind of slightly moderate baseline positive mood. And that's for evolutionary reasons. If you were depressed all the time, then you wouldn't get anything done. And similarly, if you were ecstatic, you'd just be out partying with your mates and you wouldn't, collect nuts for the winter or whatever it is that you need to do. So yeah, and then similarly with satisfaction. So that's your mood. You can also then have an overall judgment about your life. And the thing there is that because evolution is this kind of long-term battle between predators and their prey, between parasites and their hosts, we always need to be trying a little bit harder, hustle a little bit more to make things better. And so we can always see ways that our life could be better. And so if you're on this treadmill, and materialism really encourages us to think about, oh, if I could just get that nicer couch, then finally I'd have tranquility or whatever. You're never going to get to that carrot at the end of the treadmill. You're just running to stay in place. And so I think we need to get beyond thinking about being permanently satisfied with life or being in a permanently good mood and think more about how do we make this treadmill a place we want to be? How do we make it pleasant, but also dynamic, exciting, fulfilling, all this kind of stuff.
And what I love is you're embracing that as a feature, right? So there are solutions out there that say, just ignore that, pretend it's not there.
Yeah.
Right. You're going, it is there, whether we like it or not. And sometimes we like it, sometimes we don't, right? Obviously, depending on
Yeah.
And so you're just going, that's a feature of life. It's a dynamic that's there. So how can we maximize our opportunities to I guess to use the benefits that brings, right? But also not to be kind of enslaved to it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think on the enslaved point, one other doctrine that I find very helpful in this regard is Buddhism. And there are kind of secular forms of a lot of its practices. And I think a lot of its practices turn up in Christianity as well and other religions around emphasizing humility, being grateful for the things that you have, this sort of stuff. A lot of practices that you can do to reduce your wants, allow you to focus more on how other people are doing, that you can help and you could create mutually beneficial arrangements and this sort of stuff. But I do think that over the last, say, 40 years, especially, or since post-World War II, where we've had this really strong focus on growth and economics and having more money and being more individualistic, we've increasingly dug ourselves deeper into the hedonic treadmill, like where we've made that problem worse. And so now we do need to stop thinking about getting away from it and a little bit more like, let's sort of recalibrate or reconceptualize what we're trying to do here.
And you make a really obvious point in the book, but I hadn't really thought about these terms. But I guess in a resource constrained environment, and we know that the planet's resources are constrained, and we're pushing it to the limits. We're obviously we can't all keep chasing that desire. So we understand that from perhaps a natural resources perspective. But I thought it was really interesting to sort of sit there and say we have to reflect on that for ourselves, right, and recognize that each one of us individually is playing that same game. And so clocking that and being cognizant of that seems to me to be it's a key part of this, right? If you don't recognize the game that's being played or the dynamics that are there, then I guess you're going to struggle to deal with it. And so hence you spend time exploring what that is and explaining it. So that because if you don't recognize it or you don't want to address it, then or if you're choosing to ignore it is a solution, but actually you have to. And so this all plays together with the way that we interact with the planet, the broader piece as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's right that you use the word game because there's a fair bit of game theory in the book. I obviously don't get into the maths because no one wants to read that. But a lot of the fundamental insights of game theory are about how hard it is to get cooperation going. And that in order to get people to think sustainably on a planetary level, as opposed to their own personal consumption, you really need to be able to get out of your own head. And it's, in a sense, irrational to get out of your own head. Like in order to get cooperation going among humans as a species, which is our greatest advantage over all other animals, is how effectively we are capable of cooperating. We needed to evolve a whole bunch of neurological features. We needed to evolve a whole bunch of cultural things. And that a lot of the things that allow us to cooperate are grounded in art and emotion and ritual and things that we do as a community. And you can see that very prominently in all religions and the way that religions always practice things ritualistically. There's a lot of singing, there's a lot of acting, there's a lot of mythology, all this kind of stuff. If we are really focused on what am I trying to do to optimize my own life, then we can never solve these kind of collective action problems like climate change. And a lot of the book is about helping us to realize that we want to solve those collective action problems, but that's going to require each of us individually to be generous in the first instance, and also to be a bit less focused on rationality and a bit more focused on culture and art and these kind of practices.
And what I loved in the book is that you were avoiding something I've heard you say before, which is, that many books out there are just basically, it could be a blog, right? But they decided to create a whole book out of it. And you've very much gone for, this is going to be worthy of a book. And your approach to this is to look at what I might loosely term conventional wisdom or traditional ways of looking at things. In other words, you're plundering the archives in the most respectful way of ways of thinking about it. So you pull, for example, the Stoics to look about how they looked at the world. And I thought that was super interesting because nowadays the tendency, if I looked at where booksellers might try and put this book, the tendency will be quick hacks, social media is full of this stuff. If you just do this, so diet pill solutions to things. And you've gone, well, let's have a look at what we already know and look for conventional solutions. So this is a much more thoughtful approach to it, recognizing that actually this isn't necessarily about having fresh ideas. This is also about taking good ideas from the past.
Absolutely. Thanks for that very generous comment. I have a lot to say on this one. So
go for it.
I do feel like, so the genesis of this book was that I was very depressed as a teenager, and I kind of went into the bookstores looking for solution. And I found this kind of confetti of, oh, here are 10 hacks for this and here are 10 hacks for that. And, here's how to get rich quick, but it's written by someone who got rich teaching people how to get rich. It really sounds like a scam to me. And I got very frustrated with that. And then I was like, all right, I'll go to university. I'll do this systematically. I'll do a degree in philosophy and I'll read psychiatry and whatever. And so I did all that. But then you get kind of the opposite problem where people are doing these super deep dives into one particular thing. And it's often very arcane. And then there's a lot of statistics and stuff. So that's quite a big lift for a lot of people. And I appreciate that we need to popularize those sorts of ideas. And there are a lot of very good popular books out there. But what I don't think exists out there is someone that's tried to kind of put all these pieces together. And maybe it's an effort to read all those pieces at once. But I think I've tried to make the book very accessible and understandable and easy to read and that sort of thing. But it is the whole picture. So it takes a while to kind of slog through. And I think that does relate to your point about the folk stuff and generally trying to draw on wisdom from very many different places, because I think the psychologists have a lot of good things to say, the philosophers do, but then also just our primordial wisdom that we retain through folk tales, through art, through religious practices, these kind of things are also really important. So I try to include stuff there. And maybe as a very brief example, I would just mention the kind of prayers that we used to say before taking dinner in religious households that many religious households still do. So like in my Hungarian family, we would say like, thank you, Lord, for this food, and please spare it a moment for people who have less. And I think that's such a powerful cognitive and social technology to ground you in what's good in your life, why you should be grateful for it. And by grateful, I don't mean this kind of supplicant vibe so much as recognizing that other people bring a lot of this good stuff to you. And so you want to thank them particularly. And this is another thing that tends to be missing from this life hacks kind of literature, is that it's all about you. And even gratitude as a technique developed by positive psychology is often framed in this literature as a kind of selfish thing that you do to make yourself happy. It's like a little trick that you can play on yourself before bedtime. Whereas I think the more expansive notions that come to us from our religious heritage and from folk literature and that sort of thing is much more a communitarian effort. And it's about us helping each other to get to a better world in which we're all doing well.
And one of the things I thought was fascinating as I was reading, and you're absolutely right to point out, and I love this, that it isn't just like, well, we need to read things that come from academic research, right? There is just things from history or just traditions or things that we may not even necessarily be able to fully explain, but have been handed down. That convention is sort of interesting ideas can come from all sorts of different areas. They don't just have to come from academia or sort of philosophy. And so as you were looking at those things, there were so many things that resonated, that made sense to me. But there's something about modern society, and you've pointed towards this in terms of the sort of consumerism in the loosest sense, that means that sometimes those things don't work. And there's a lot of trend now to saying, if only we could return to traditional values. And there are lots of people out there proposing that if we could just turn back the clock, everything would be okay. And what I liked was you're striking the balance of having respect for the past and recognizing that there is some value there. It's in many cases, what sustained the species, but also recognizing that we can't just kind of wish time back and wish the world away. Therefore, we need to look at history and the things that we've inherited and recognize what's valuable and what's not.
Yeah, a big comment. So let me try to take a few pieces of that. So maybe on the science side. So I think there is a lot of really great science being done at the moment, but I'm also a bit frustrated by the dominance of this kind of science-backed advice stuff that's coming out at the moment, because a lot of the science is pretty shoddy. And because we're so committed to getting 10 quick and easy hacks all the time, everyone's hungry for the latest piece of science, and science doesn't move that quickly. And when you expect it to move that quickly, you end up overselling a bunch of stuff that's actually kind of junk. Like, we haven't spent enough time on the science yet to figure out whether it's true. We have had a bunch of big scandals in science over the last couple of years with people like Dan Ariely and Francesca Gino being accused of fraud, basically. These are some of the biggest names in behavioral science. And there's generally a lot of problems like replication crises, theory crises, all sorts of stuff that doesn't make it into the commercial press. that makes me a little bit nervous about just kind of saying that only science-backed stuff is correct and that there's plenty of science-backed stuff to go around. There's also a lot of really good wisdom, as you say, in the folk stuff. And maybe I'll mention two things here. So one that was really powerful for me in terms of why I should take seriously insights that don't come to me packaged in the scientific way. So don't come to me packaged in logic and experiments and statistical evidence, is this little kind of Celtic myth where sometimes new mothers have their spirits whisked away to the fairy kingdom. And as a result of this, they become listless and despondent and kind of antisocial, and they don't look after their new babies. And the only way to bring their spirit back from the fairy world is for everyone in the village to visit them on a regular basis, spend time with them, even though they're maybe a bit unpleasant to spend time with when they don't have a spirit. Look after their baby so that when their spirit does come back, they'll be ready to parent again. And in this way, gradually, you can remind the person's spirit that there's a lot of love for them in the village and coax it back. Now, if you're a hard-nosed scientist, you'd be like, what is this nonsense? But I think it's really clearly a story about postnatal depression. And the important thing here is that it gets the diagnosis right. Sorry, it gets the diagnosis wrong. Like the spirit hasn't been taken away to the fairy, but it gets the prescription right, which is what we nowadays call social prescribing in the medical sciences, where you want to try to embed someone in a social system that gives them the support they need until they recover mentally. And it communicates that prescription in a way that would be quite meaningful to a lot of people. Whereas to the typical human, if you say, oh, this mother's serotonin uptake inhibitors are disrupted or whatever, they need these pills, that just doesn't really mean anything to most people. And a lot of the folk stories that we get and a lot of the wisdom that had come down through the centuries in those kind of formats is often much more accessible to people in this emotional way. And I think that's quite important. I don't know if you want to come in there or I can keep moving on to the other
I love
point.
that. As you were talking, I was just thinking, it's almost like they've got the market, the idea's there, they've got the marketing right, the evidence is lacking. And I think that's super powerful because as we know, you can have a brilliant idea, but if it's not effectively communicated, it's not going to let, it doesn't matter how amazing your thinking is, right? If you can't get it through to other people. So I love this idea of actually the problem has been solved. It's been intelligently solved. It's just they haven't got the backup and we can feed the backup in later on, but recognizing the power of those things and being open to that, I think it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I do think a lot about the fact that humans have been around for thousands and thousands of years. And I'm very skeptical that we were unhappy that whole time.
You've really pissed off people.
Yeah, it's just been miserable our entire existence. And that over the next technological horizon will finally be. It seems to me much more likely that we've actually known kind of how to be well and how to find happiness throughout our primordial eons of existence. And so we should often be looking more at the kind of things that we've always had. So we've always had communities, we've always had friendships, we've always had family, we've always had ritual and culture and art and practices that we do together, dancing, maypole dances. I love these kind of folksy things. Like they might seem a bit lame now, but I've actually, in the last like maybe 2 years, I've super hardcore come back to thinking about fates and parades and all the kind of stuff that rural communities still tend to do much more so than urban ones. But I think in there lies a lot of our ancient wisdom about how to be well and how to be happy. And we should value that stuff.
And so as you're going through these, how are you picking what to include? Because if I look sort of the full canon of all the things you could have looked at, I mean, you could have written 20 books to cover all the traditions. And how did you decide where to focus?
That's a good question. I think very sort of instrumentally, like I had a kind of vague plan about the book where the first third would be about how to live a pleasant life. The second third would be about how to live a fulfilling life and mostly about self-actualization. So how to find the values that suit you and how to find people that you can practice those values with. And then the third part of the book would be on how to live a valuable life. And it would have a lot to do with nihilism and finding a quest and then meta-modernity, which maybe we can get to at some point. So I think as I was going through that, I was like, oh, here, this would fit, here, this would fit, that sort of stuff. And I was conscious that I wanted this book to be for a fairly popular audience. And I did want it to be largely grounded in scientific sort of insights. And I didn't want to get too distracted talking about folk mysteries and that sort of thing. And there are other people who are doing that really well I think Martin Shaw, who had a podcast series during COVID called The Smoke Hole or something like that, Smoke Hole Sessions. He does amazing stuff, kind of capturing a lot of the insights that we have in these long traditions of literature and fairy tales and that sort of thing, and in a way that's way more accessible than reading Carl Jung or something like that and dream analysis. And he gives a lot of public talks about it, and he's a very compelling storyteller. So I think there are other people doing that stuff who are doing it better than me. I just found places where I think it was easy enough to staple it in. And I often tried to find more contemporary popular stuff that I think is doing very much what a lot of our traditional work did, but as you say, in ways that are more relevant to the contemporary world. So in particular, that fairy tales don't talk about technology because they didn't have it, but technology is like the defining feature of our time, along with the climate crisis. So are there stories emerging, and are there new mythologies that are trying to distill patterns that our subconscious minds are noticing around technology and the environment in ways that are compelling and allow us to access these things intuitively, imaginatively, emotionally, rather than necessarily rationally?
And the thing that really struck me, which is difficult and challenging to read and yet makes so much sense and is so much better, I think, than the alternative perspective, was this idea that we have to work this stuff out for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the quick fix solutions is always follow this game plan and you'll be fine. The point you make in the book is that actually what makes all of us tick individually is different. And so unfortunately, and this is where it is challenging, is you have to work it out for yourself. There isn't a pre-made blueprint. And I loved you talk about, the sort of the parents that push their kids into doing something because that's what the parents perceive as the right thing. And there's very much a message here of you have to go suss this out for yourself, right? Work out what makes you tick. And that's a critical part of what you talk about, which is hard, but I think is far more realistic because we recognize that we're all a bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. So most of chapter 4 is about this, I guess, and maybe also the first chapter of the book. So the first chapter of the book is saying, you've got this hedonic treadmill problem. How do you then figure out how to make the treadmill a place you want to be? And the first thing to do is to learn to listen to your own advice. So you need to shut down all the influences, all the kind of external noise that's coming at you, some of which might be really well-intentioned and wise and sensible, but just for a moment, unplug from all that, including from me. So there's a part of the book that I'm proud of where I'm like, just put the book down. Don't worry about it.
I love that. I just thought that's so fresh. Right?
And I think some other stuff that I've been talking about with people is that it's worth trying to think about what sort of environments make you reflective and make you turn inwards. So I find that I like to go out to natural places where time feels like it's always been the same. Like that creek has just been going like that for hundreds of years. And I find that puts me in a very reflective mode and it allows me to turn inwards a lot more. Other people might just like to run a bath, put some lavender in there, whatever. They'll feel zen. I know you mentioned to me that you like to look out the window on long train journeys. I also found that can be very powerful for me. So try to find situations or environments that allow you to have that internal dialogue. And then you've got to learn to listen. It's not going to happen straight away. But a lot of the techniques that I suggest in the book come out of psychotherapy, where a lot of the time people come to the psychotherapist's office, and my agent actually happens to be a psychotherapist. So I'll quote him directly. He's like, people always come to you with the same problems. I can't sleep. I'm really anxious all the time and I don't know why. And then you've got to say, well, okay, let's investigate that. And when people can't sleep, it's understandable that Jung and Freud and these other early people got really into dream analysis, because your dreams are a way that your subconscious is like trying to communicate, but it's very hard for you to listen to. Now, most of us, I don't think, really need to get all that into the dream analysis. But what we do need to do is think back to things that were relatively pure events for us that were quite communicative. So one thing that I suggest, and that is common advice in a lot of this sort of literature, is to think back to your childhood, to events that were very transformative for you, or things that really incensed you. Either you felt like really happy doing something, or you felt like that something was really evil and unjust and that it shouldn't be that way. These are the kind of signals of what things might be authentic values to you, authentic behaviors to you. And starting from these kind of big emotional signals is where you can start to learn to listen to yourself. You tend to communicate with yourself emotionally rather than through logic. And I think that makes it doubly unlikely that a self-help book is going to give you what you need because they have to communicate with you rationally.
And I love the idea of tapping into feelings, and a lot of the work that I do with kind of compliance functions and people trying to impose rules on other people is I sort of go, the question I say is go ask the people that you're trying to impose rules on, ask them a
Mm,
very crude question, right? What pisses you off? Because there's
it's a good one.
something, and I'm not interested in things that are slightly irritating. I mean, the stuff that's viscerally really annoying.
Mm,
And so, because that to me points towards, here's a rule. If something really irritates me, I'm going to try and find ways around it. Right? It
mm,
represents something that is that's unlikely to be sustainable as a rule or a proposition. And I love this idea of being able to just actually recognize. Yeah, what you're pointing towards was being honest about how we feel about things, and we don't have
mm.
to like the stuff that's cool or the stuff that's popular. And you cited, and I hadn't really thought about the power this has, but Reddit as a good illustration. I mean, there's some awful stuff on Reddit, but
Oh
that's
yeah.
not, we're not talking about that. But what you might got to be really careful how I phrase this, but the special interest groups
Oh yeah.
that we now have the case, and this is what I think one of the joys of technology. You can go and find people that have similar interests that you
Mm,
might not otherwise be able to find. And I'm talking about sensible interest here,
mhm.
clearly, but
Sure.
hobbies and passions and those sorts of things.
Mhm.
And so I love that it wasn't all a negative thing about actually, well, the you just got to sort of be is we have you've pointed people in the direction of saying we can build these communities, and therefore
Mhm.
being true to who you are and what you like and don't like
Mhm.
I thought that was incredibly powerful and uplifting. And
No,
you've
that's
given
great.
us a solution to how to look at it.
Well, I really liked your question about what pisses you off because I could definitely apply that to my own workplace. And the things that really piss me off are usually not the things that we're working on. And they're also the things that I need to take to a committee. And then there'll be like 14 other committees that it needs to go up through. And then finally, I won't have to answer all these emails. So yeah, I think that is very powerful. And being honest about your feelings is also crucial. And I think that is a bit of a culture change. Certainly it was a change for me personally. So one section of the book is on emotional intelligence, and particularly this hack, which is that when you're having a big feeling or when you see someone having a big feeling that you care about, you should ask, do you want to be helped, heard, or hugged? And this was totally transformative for me because I'd always felt that people just needed to be helped. And I also thought that I just needed to be helped. But actually, oftentimes I needed a hug. And I was very bad at asking for care. And I think our culture tends to kind of encourage people to be more rational and logical and scientific in the way they solve problems. But often it's not really like the problem that needs to be solved. It's the feelings that you need to be honest about. And then we need to unpack where those feelings have come from and what their like toxic consequences are and all this sort of stuff, which I think the question that you mentioned really gets at those kind of issues. Um, yeah. And then in terms of Reddit, just what you were saying really reminded me that my favorite thing about Reddit is that sometimes you have such a niche question, like
Right.
you're playing a video game or something and you're like, how does this work? And there'll be someone on Reddit who's answered that exact question and it'll be the first hit on Google. And it's incredible how frequently that happens. I don't know, you have some esoteric camera for the 1980s and you're like, does anyone know where I can find lenses for the like Nokia or whatever? And there was like, yeah. Like there's this weird retailer in rural Japan who still has like a stockpile of them or something. Here, I've got his phone number. Yeah, like just amazing stuff like that on Reddit. And there's plenty of turgid stuff as well. But I think relative to other social media sites, it's definitely one of the more kind of wholesome and communitarian ones. And I think what's interesting to think about there is that Reddit is moderated. It's moderated on a volunteers basis. And I can't help but think that that does have a lot to do with the fact that most Reddit threads tend to be relatively constructive discourses where people tend to operate in good faith, tend to kind of try to understand each other, unlike, say, Twitter, which is now a complete cesspit of people just yelling at each other. Yeah.
And you've talked a lot about. I mean, I mentioned the Stoics as one example. You've looked at history. One of
Mm,
the challenges, I guess, and I reference those people that want us to hark back to yesteryear, often to an era that they
mm.
never experienced themselves. If I
Yeah.
think about in the UK, a lot of sort of Second World War revivalists and people that were
Yes.
too young to be around but still
Yeah. The
remember
Blitz.
on
Yeah.
some level. How do we know what we should take from the past and what we should?
Wow. That's a tough question. I haven't really thought about that one. Um, I definitely, I guess I would come back always to emotions as the first point of call. So what feels powerful when it's explained to you? And I think Jordan Peterson, who you may have mentioned earlier, I think he does do a really good job in his Bible lectures, which he used to give well before he became famous and then well before he became a little bit crazy. He is now, I guess I would want to say he's a shadow of his former self. But his Bible lectures were bangers. And I'm like deeply atheist, and I still found these lectures extremely powerful for kind of unpacking the symbolic content of the Old Testament, and unpacking a lot of the kind of important lessons in there about things like sacrificing for the future and what's involved in that, and how much of a kind of cognitive transformation that would have been in people to understand that there is something 5 years from now. And if you kind of make a plan now and stick to it, things will be different in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And in a age where a roving barbarian horde could come and wipe you out next week, that's quite a big change in the way you think. You're not so short-termist. So there's a lot of powerful stuff like that. And I think you just got to expose yourself to a lot of ideas. And this is why I think Martin Shaw is really good, because he does talk about a lot of little bits of wisdom in folk tales. And if something strikes you as really powerful, then just sit with it for a while and try to unpack why it is that you find it powerful. But equally, if you read something and you think, oh, gross, then that also tells you that it's probably run out of steam. So the example I give in the book that I think is not very controversial is that the Virgin Mary as a woman who had an immaculate conception, and that's the kind of symbol of the ultimately valuable feminine, doesn't really cut through for a lot of women today. And that's quite understandable to me. And I think trying to, as a man, take society back to that is a bit naff. So there, I think those are the kind of places where we want to try to figure out what to rescue from that heritage and what we need to let go and accept is no longer working for us. Think about why it's no longer working for us, and with an emphasis on us. Try to have that dialogue in an empathetic way, and then think about what kind of new stories we need to tell. I think often here there's a kind of impatience where people are like, oh, some group in society is like, well, that's not working for me anymore. And the group in society that values that thing that's not working anymore is like, well, what do you want instead? And there's no ready packaged answer, because I think in this case, we're really kind of reaching into the void and trying to come up with some new content. And that's again why that new content is going to need to come to us through mythology and art and myth making and meaning making. And I think that's part of why the new atheism movement terminated a bit, because Richard Dawkins and his compatriots were really good at knocking down a lot of these old stuff, but they were like aggressively disinterested in building new things in a lot of cases. Like I remember there was a debate where Dawkins said something like, what do you mean the meaning of the mountain? That's a ludicrous question. The mountain has a cause, that's all. And that's not useful to people. Like I see where he's coming from, but people do want to feel like the world is enchanted, do want to feel like there's meaning out there. And we can only build that emotionally and creatively.
And the thrust of the book really is to, and correct me if this is wrong, but what I took from it was this idea of sort of sort yourself out, work out what you're about, what matters to you, and then that sets you on a, because it's almost, it reminded me of, when you go on a plane and they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on before helping others. Which is sort of bloodily obvious advice, but you can't help other people until you're sorted in of yourself. And so I love this idea of kind of thinking around what makes you tick, what do you want to do, what's your vocation, what's important to you, what do you like, what do you dislike, sort of really being comfortable before you can start to, and that's what takes you off what not takes you off the treadmill, but allows you to navigate the treadmill, to then shift to these other alternative spaces where you can start to think about how you can bring that to bear in society.
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. So you need to put your own house in order before you can help other people with their situation. And when your house is in order, it gives you more capacity to help other people with their situations. I think similar kind of story for romantic relationships. If you don't respect yourself, if you don't love yourself, it's harder for you to love other people, and it's harder for you to engage in healthy, mutually beneficial relationships. You tend to get stuck in toxic ones because you're desperate for validation and this sort of stuff. So it is important to have some foundation of a sense of yourself before you really embark on the world. At the same time, I think there's a process of self-discovery, certainly, but then most of well-being is a process of self-creation. And that process of self-creation is iterative. So you go back over and over again, trying things, and it's something that you do with other people. I think one of the messages of the book that I'm most keen to emphasize is that well-being is something we do together. And this is, again, something that's missing from the vast majority of self-help books, because they're trying to sell you something. And saying go and talk to your mates is not a really good,
Yes, it's
not a good
massively
commercial
marketable
proposition.
proposition.
Yeah, that's right. But that's basically it. So once you've got a sense for what it is that you might want to do, that's going to inform a whole bunch of things for you in terms of your values, all the way down to your consumption practices. So in the book, I give a kind of worked example of, say you wanted to become an astronaut. It's just that it's easy to give these very ambitious cases and then work from there. You could want to be something much more mundane than that, and that might be exactly right for you. It might make you very happy, and it might make you super important to other people. Like if you just want to, I don't know, run the local farmers market or something and be doing a really good job of that, you could be super valuable to your community. But let's just take the astronaut example for a second. So what is involved in being an astronaut? You've got to be pretty fit and you've got to be pretty good at science. So you're going to have to go take some courses in physics and chemistry. You're going to have to join a gymnastics club or something like that. And those are both things that you're going to be doing substantially with other people. It's hard to teach yourself chemistry. At the very least, like maybe you can find some good YouTube videos or do one of these MOOCs or something. And then maybe you're on Reddit and people can give you advice about your chemistry problem sets. But mostly you're going to be doing that by yourself in partnership with some other people. Gymnastics, you might be out there doing tumbles by yourself, but you're going to need a coach. You're going to need other people to support you and be enthusiastic for you and that sort of thing. And then you're going to reflect on the emotional and social feedback that you get while you go through that process. So if, for example, all that feedback is really good, then it's just going to encourage you to double down and invest more. So you're like, oh, maybe I really do want to be an astronaut. I'm loving being fit. I'm loving astrochemistry. Let's do even more of that. I'm going to do some maths on the side. I'm going to pick up a few other sports. I'm going to learn engineering so I understand how shuttles work. I don't really know how you go about being an astronaut, but probably something like that. But it might also be that this emotional feedback is more complicated. And so a lot of the book is talking about how to learn to introspect on emotional signals and tease them apart. So for example, I talk about the motivation spectrum. So you have different types of motivation running from relatively extrinsic, where you need to use a lot more willpower to get yourself to do those kind of activities, to things that are relatively intrinsically motivated and that you do spontaneously. And broadly, the things that are intrinsically motivated are the things that are organic to you or inherent to you. That doesn't mean that they're good. That doesn't mean that they're the ones that you want. Like you might find that you fold really easily. Like when someone puts pressure on you, you just acquiesce to them and you hate that about yourself. So sometimes you need to change your intrinsic motivations, but often what you need to be doing is bringing your extrinsic motivations, get rid of the ones that are really bad and internalize the others. And so there's going to be lots of feedback associated with and I can talk a bit more about that, but I feel like I've been yarning for a while.
No, keep going. I love, no, because I think it's, and this is why, when I said earlier that it was like, it's easy to read because you've written in a really engaging style and you've chosen examples.
Thanks.
But it's hard work in the sense that if you're jumping into the book in the spirit in which it's been written, you're having to think quite a lot and pause and reflect and say, well, how does that apply to me? And I guess the antithesis to it not being the quick fix is that I found myself stopping and going, how does that apply? And then I found myself sort of jumping back to things that, so in a way, what you're trying to tackle here is that this is a really big challenge, right? Obviously it's a big challenge and there aren't simple solutions to it. And so, people shouldn't buy this book expecting a quick fix, right? Plenty of other quote unquote solutions available if that's what you're looking for. I think you'll be disappointed, but but this was engaging, got me wanting to think about things. But it's not, it's also tiring in a way because you have to think. It does provoke you into reflecting on things that sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable, to the points you were just making.
I mean, I hope so. Yeah, I think life is pretty important. You should take it seriously. And I hope that this book is not a waste of time for anybody. That's kind of the key thing. Like maybe you don't get through the whole thing. Maybe you don't find that all of it's relevant to you, but however far you get, I think you'll find some value in that. And then you can just put that into practice and maybe you come back later for the rest of it. I don't think that anyone's I really hope that no one picks up this book and thinks that was irrelevant to me. And I also hope that no one picks it up and thinks, oh, this is too hard or something like that. Like it might be hard to do the whole thing at once. But each of the individual pieces should be relatively accessible, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also back to ingrained behaviors and the way we think about the world, right? We know intuitively that, I don't know, if we had like a drug habit or something, we're not going to be able to kick that from one day to the
Mm,
next, right? We need to think about that, and ditto fitness, right? You can't suddenly be unfit and
mhm,
then just rock up to the gym for half an hour and be
mhm,
super fit. So we know that these things are hard and challenging, and I think the
mhm,
way you've described it there worked for me, because I sort of found myself going, I've got to stop and just reflect on what that means, right? And
mhm.
almost try some of these things out. There was a little bit of
Yeah.
me, and I wonder what you thought about it. It was almost like a little bit of a sort of a gym for how I looked at the world and who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And
Mhm,
so I was finding myself just stopping, going, actually, I don't want to read anymore, not because it's not interesting, but because I need
mhm,
to actually take this away,
mhm,
and almost in a way, it points to, there's a huge amount of inefficiency in these
mhm,
processes, and that struck me as, in the modern world, we want things quickly, quick solutions, quick fixes. And
mhm.
actually, a lot of what you're proposing involves whiling time reflecting on things and
Yeah,
musing on it.
definitely. No, so much in there to talk about. Let me first say that I try to write. I'm very inspired by T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which is a very famous book about. It's kind of a retelling of the Arthurian legends. I think the character of Lancelot in this book is one of the most sophisticated characters ever. He's genuinely trying to be a good person and failing, and I think the exploration of that is super interesting. But what's really striking about The Once and Future King is that it's written in this style that you just can't read it fast. It like forces you to sit down with it, and it's beautiful. So you enjoy reading it. But at the time I read it, I remember that I was used to reading a lot of like Isabel Allende at the time and Milan Kundera and a lot of these very breezy authors that you can just power through. And I felt good that I was reading so much. And then I got this book and I was like, this is a really good book, but I feel like I've been reading it for a month. Um, but that was good. And I remember that book so much more now. And one thing that strikes me about a lot of the commercial books that are super readable is that they're so readable, you almost can't remember at the end of it what it is that you read. And that's why they need to have these things at the end where they're like, here's like 3 activities that you can do tonight. But there's so many activities that then you also end up with this kind of like confetti of stuff. And you want to make a list and come back to it after your copy every morning to be like, have I taken a cold shower at the right time today? These sorts of things. So I definitely wanted to write a book that is forcing you to think, and that way you'll remember more of it. And you might not remember all of it, but at least it will sit with you. And I think I mentioned this explicitly at one point in the book. Often a powerful idea will emerge for you again later in a way that you don't expect. You just need to kind of have it in there. It's not an activity that you need to do every day. It's not an activity that you need to do every week. It's just some wisdom that on some level you internalize. And at some point in your life, something will pop up and your brain will make the connection. And it'll be like, oh, this is kind of like that thing that Fabian was talking about. And then you'll change your behavior there. And this brings me to, I think, a very important point that you sort of raised there, which is that there's a lot of talk about, say, changing your habits. So around the gym, for example. And I think a lot of the commercial imperative now is to write the next Atomic Habits because it's sold 12 million copies. Everyone wants you to do that. And Atomic Habits, I think, is a very good book in terms of being science backed and all that sort of stuff. But it opens with this statement that if you want to change your habits, you need to think about them in terms of identity. So don't say, oh, no, thanks, I don't smoke. Say, no, thanks, I'm not a smoker. And I think that's broadly true. But it immediately raises this question for me, which is, well, who do I want to be? And there's no real engagement with that much harder question. That's not just a matter of kind of a few quick hacks and whatever, and here's a diagram. And I think my book is trying to get at a lot more of these kind of upstream aspects of your behavior that probably do require you to just spend a bit of time looking out the window on a long haul train, maybe more than once.
And how has writing it changed you? Because I mean, I recognize, obviously, that's not,
Mm.
again, right back to, not the quick fix thing. Oh, I suddenly finished, and suddenly the
Yeah.
light bulb came on. You will have had realizations you're going. But I mean, it always strikes me that when you're looking at a subject like this, clearly you would have been going through this process yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been writing this book for about 20 years. I did make it my professional life over the course of that time. I think the self-actualization stuff that's in chapters 4 and 5, like I lived that and it worked for me. It might not work for everyone. I recognize that I'm a bit peculiar, but people seem to think it's got legs. The parts that were most transformative for me came towards the end, particularly the stuff in chapter 6, which is called Better Together and is all about how well-being is a kind of communal activity. And there, I think the biggest changes for me were, I've alluded to them already, this shift away from being hyper-rational to thinking more about all the different ways that we can get to truth and the importance of our emotion and the importance of care. So alongside helped, heard, or hugged, I had an idea that came to me from Cassie Thornton, who I had on my podcast, which is called Apodstomology, and I interview young academics. So it's probably not for everybody. It's pretty nerdy and technical. But anyway, I had Cassie Thornton on there. She's an activist and an artist, and she has this idea called the hologram. And she was talking a lot about the fact that in recent decades, we have commercialized and professionalized care in a way that makes us reluctant to ask for it, because we don't feel like we can repay the care that we get, because care is this very valuable thing that's worth money. And we also feel very reluctant to offer it because we don't feel qualified to offer that kind of care. And this then causes a huge care deficit in society and also cuts us off from each other, and we become isolated in our own little rooms, feeling uncared for and nervous. And these kind of ideas were quite new to me, but are now, I think, really central to the way I think about well-being. And they have changed me a lot. I feel like I'm a much more emotionally engaged person, and I think a lot more about how I can learn things through my intuition, through my body, these kind of things, rather than just through logic. Maybe I'll mention one more thing here, which came at the very, very end. So I met an agent at a house party in London a few months ago, maybe a year ago. And I was complaining to her about how much publishers and everything want you to include a personal story in all your work. And as an Australian, that's like anathema to me. Like, you were just not allowed to talk about yourself in Australian culture. I always tell people, like Nick Riewoldt, who's this Australian rules football player, once just put in the most dominant performance in a grand final of like any footballer ever. And afterwards, the on-field commentator was there being like, just gushing at him, like, "Oh my God, Nick, that was incredible. You were everywhere. You kicked all the goals." And Nick Riewoldt was like, "Yeah, the boys did really well today." And he just refused to talk about himself at all. And he was like deadpan despite the greatest achievement of his life. That's Australian culture. And so when the publishers were like, "Mark, tell us about yourself," and all this kind of stuff, I was like, "I don't want to do that." And then the agent said to me, and this was super powerful, said, "I appreciate that, and you academics always say this kind of stuff, but most people connect with a person before they connect with an idea. And they're going to get the information from you through this emotional connection that they have with you, not through the logic that you're putting out." And that's been so powerful to me in my teaching and my interpersonal relationships and all sorts of stuff. So I have changed in quite a lot of ways in writing this book.
I love that. It strikes me that as we think about role models, and many of the role models, and we can point to politics, we can point to social media, we can point to other, seem to me to be pointing in the opposite direction to the one you're proposing in the book, where there's a dominant narrative of selfishness, of greed, almost like greed is good type logic. And I wonder what you thought about that, because that seems to me to be problematic.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we are awash in very bad role models at the moment, very selfish people, very nihilistic people, so deeply dishonest, and kind of the point is that it's dishonest and they celebrate that and they're kind of spreading toxicity, and it's very disturbing, particularly because they seem to be electorally successful in many cases. So very concerning. And I agree that I think especially young men don't have particularly good role models, but I feel like even young women don't have particularly good role models that are a blend of traditional femininity and new femininity. There's kind of either girl boss or the Madonna, and not much kind of in between. So where are we going to get these new role models from? And in the very last chapter of the book, I talk about some of these new mythologies. And I think the work of Hayao Miyazaki, who's this very famous Japanese animator who runs Studio Ghibli, I think he has a lot of really powerful new gender archetypes in his work. And I think for me as a man, it was very powerful to watch Princess Mononoke, which he originally was going to call the myth of Ashitaka, who's the male protagonist of that. And there's this super powerful scene for me where Mononoke she's like riding a wolf into this mining colony, ready to kill the leader there, because she's so angry about the destruction of the environment. It's a major theme of his movies, and I think very relevant to our situation today. And Ashitaka thinks this is like not going to be a good outcome. So he's essentially sort of intervenes in her assassination attempt. But he doesn't attack her. He doesn't even disarm her, really. He just uses his martial prowess to absorb all her violent energy without being overwhelmed by it, until eventually he's able to kind of gently knock her out. And then he carries her out of there at great risk to his own safety. And then when she wakes up, he employs his main superpower, which is active listening. And he just spends a lot of time hearing her side of the situation, letting her vent, letting her get her emotions out. And I think this is a really powerful expression of something that's very masculine, but in quite a new way, where it's still about managing your emotions and still about being relatively less emotional, but in a way that makes you very beneficial to the emotional energy of your world. And this is a very big contrast from, say, the Tate brothers or some of these other like misogyny influences. And so I think there are some emerging role models, but unfortunately they are often not in the places that we would traditionally have looked, like politics and sport and things like that.
And so I guess is your point that the cycle will right itself, or do we need to actively do something?
Oh, we definitely need to actively do something big time. I think we are definitely in the midst of a kind of cultural battle for the spirit of the 21st century between cancel culture, which is not a left or right wing phenomenon, like everybody's engaged in it. Everyone is feeling like they don't know what they're about. They don't know what their society's about, but a lot of things scare them. A lot of things make them angry, and they're kind of lashing out all over the place to try to deal with that. What we actually need to do is to try to be empathetic with people. I think John Cena, the former pro wrestler, says it pretty well. Like, we should just sort of be patient and understand that everyone's trying to find their way in a very confusing and chaotic world. And we also need to be kind to each other. I think that's the main message of Everything Everywhere All at Once, which won a bunch of Oscars, is that we need to be empathetic to this chaotic sense that we all have. We need to reach out to each other and say, okay, like, what's distressing you? What brings you joy? What things do you value? How can we build communities of this sort where we celebrate these values together, where we care for each other? Other people are going to be doing things that we're really not into, but as long as they don't harm us, as long as they're not grossly harming each other, that's kind of fine. Just let them get on with that. And then this way we can start to build a better sense for what we're about, collectively, communally, and in a way that's wholesome and mutually supportive. But I think this is a really big struggle. I do see it coming out, I see the early shoots of growth of this kind of stuff, but I also see a lot of cancel culture and a lot of nihilism and toxicity. So we have a real challenge on our hands.
And there's an interesting thing there, which is you point towards people need to understand yourself, work out what you're about. And I loved some of the examples you give in the book of hobbies. And there's one that really struck with me visually, where you said maybe you want to build the Titanic out of matchsticks.
Yeah.
Right, which I just thought was, I'm a massive Lego fan, right? So that's on one level that resonates. I thought that's utterly insane. But I thought it was a beautiful example of, right, here's something that just wouldn't work for me, but I could see if you were up for that. Right, that's a very cool thing. So we have this idea of those individual things that make us all individual, and your farmers market example is a really good one, right?
Mm-hmm.
That might not be aspirational for some people, but for someone else, it's exactly what they're here to do. So we've got these individual things, and then we recognize the benefits of having diversity and cognitive diversity. And people if we all had the same skill sets, we'd be screwed.
Yeah,
because we need that broad range of things. But bringing those two things in a way, those work really well. And I could see that the idea of sort of self-mastery and understanding what you're about, so that you can bring your best, whatever that means, to society. But there is this challenge of then bringing people together. And the more you encourage people to go off and look for what makes them, and to focus on that, you could say that ran at odds with this idea of working together and collaboration and understanding each other. Because the more I'm encouraged to double down on who I am and what I believe in, the more you create that. How do we square that circle? Because that seems to me the thing that we need to do.
Absolutely right. And I think this is a really great question. And I think you phrased it so well, like better than I could have phrased it. So let me start with this cognitive diversity point that you made. So there's a quote that I love, and I can't quite remember who said it at the moment, but it's something like, do whatever it is that you enjoy and that you're good at, even if you're not the best at it. The forests would be very quiet if the only birds that sang there were the birds that sang best. And so you might not be the best. And I think we don't need to be the best. And becoming your best self also is not the same as becoming your most optimized self. So it's not about out competing everyone and getting as high as you can up the hierarchy. It's about being a kind of person that you're proud of being. And that might be a very mundane thing. And it might actually be about how you make sacrifices for other people and you don't try to dominate the hierarchy and this sort of stuff. And this very kind of anti-capitalist sort of sentiment that what we're trying to do is be proud of ourselves, but in a way that's coherent with what everyone around us is trying to do. And we appreciate that we are members of a society, we are members of neighborhoods and professional organizations and friendship networks and all that sort of stuff. And that we can be little priests for our networks, keeping an eye on how everyone's interconnected and how we can link people up to help each other. And in this way, we create a nice ecosystem that's very self-reinforcing. So I'm not quite sure how to completely square the circle, as you say, but it does seem to me like the key thing to appreciate maybe is the distinction between self-optimization and self-actualization, and also to appreciate that self-actualization is something that you do with other people, and that we are also doing that not just at an individual level, but at a kind of neighborhood, cultural, global level. We are all trying to decide what it is that we're about. And that doesn't mean competition, because when you get ahead in a competition, you get ahead at the expense of someone else. And I don't want to completely disparage competition effects. They can be really powerful and they're a spur to a lot of the great things that we achieve athletically, for example. But I do think that for the average person, it's much less about competition and much more about collaboration. And we need to get to that kind of attitude in the 21st century.
I love that. That, I think, is the perfect mark on which to finish it. Is there anything that we should have talked about? Any major points that you wanted to bring out?
No, there's a lot more in the book, I guess. I hope you would second that. But I really like the points that we covered, and I appreciate your questions, which I think were really really on point.
Amazing. Well, look, I normally would ask guests what they're up to next, but you've given us a hint of that. And so I'd love to, at this point, as and when you're ready to talk about your next book, please feel free to come back on the show. But in the meantime, I can only recommend, it's not, as I say, it's not, your publisher's not going to thank me for this. It's not the easiest read, but not because it's not easy to read, but because if you are taking this book seriously, you need to think about things. And the joy I found with this was that it paused me to recognize the things that I was doing well and stuff that I'd like you mentioned the train, looking out the train carriage window. That's not something anybody ever told me to do. I just sort of felt like it was something I got something from, and you've helped me to. So many things you've pointed out to me why they work well for me. There's other things where I've really realized that's why that's not working well. And you've given me a ton of other things to reflect on that are going to help me. So thank you for broadening my own personal toolkit. And I'd recommend people to read it to understand themselves a lot better, but also recognize how they can then tweak things. So not the easiest read in that sense, but fabulous, really, really thought-provoking, as people would have detected on the show. So before I let you go, remind people what it is called.
It's called Beyond Happy, How to Rethink Happiness and Find Fulfillment. And I'm very glad, thank you for reading it. And I'm very glad that you found it to be of value to you. Authors will always say, as long as it changes one person's life, it's worth
Job
doing.
done.
So
Job
yeah,
done.
well, you can check out now. I'm happy.
Amazing. Mark, but above all right now, thank you for writing a great book. Thank you for the work that you do. Clearly very, very important. I love the fact that we have academics like you that are tackling challenging issues in the way that you, and the sense of humor and the joy that you bring to what you do is so apparent. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
But above all, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Mark for appearing. To find out more about Mark, his book, Beyond Happy, How to Rethink Happiness and Find Fulfillment, and his research, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, I would love it if you could do so. It's really, really helpful. It allows other people to find the show and lets me know that you're enjoying it. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, and there are over 300 of them now, visit the show's website at humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Why not take a little bit of time to reflect on what really makes you tick beyond the constant chase for happiness? And above all, thank you so much for listening.